As was mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Christian Medical and Dental Association. We are an ecumenical organization of 1,600 Christian doctors from all across Canada. I think Catholics are about 20%, and we have all kinds of Christian denominations represented. And so my ministry is to those 1,600, and our goal is to empower and help them to integrate their Christian faith into medical practice. And that's not easy today in Canada. It's a real challenge. And for over a decade now, we've been working on protecting conscience rights for Christian physicians. And that is basically to allow them to practice according to their faith. And in addition to that, we have been trying to advocate against, first of all, the acceptance of MAiD in Canada, and also to try to stop the expansion. So that's what I'm here tonight to talk about. So first of all, what is MAiD? The term MAiD may be relatively new to you, but it is undoubtedly a term that you're hearing more and more, because as it gets into Canadian culture, probably many of you have had family members or friends who have opted for this route. Medical assistance in dying is an umbrella term that includes euthanasia, which is death by a lethal injection, and also assisted suicide, where the patient normally ingests medication that ends their life. So medical assistance in dying is both euthanasia and assisted suicide. Most of the cases in Canada are euthanasia. Now, you may be wondering how we got to where we are today. In 2016, MAiD became legalized through legislation that was passed in our national parliament. It was passed because of a decision that started off with one judge's decision in the British Columbia Supreme Court. One judge decided that she wanted to overturn the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in Rodriguez that said that euthanasia in Canada should be illegal. This judge decided to overturn that. And when she overturned that, it went up as far as the Supreme Court of Canada, and they agreed with her. But the problem with that was that her decision set the criteria for who could get MAiD in Canada and who could not. And once the criteria is set in Canada by judges, approved by the Supreme Court, then any attempt by Parliament to legislate, if they don't agree with this one judge, can be struck down under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And that's exactly what's been happening in Canada. It's like Pandora's box. Once it's opened, it can't be closed. And especially because every time you go to court, the courts only look at the needs of one particular patient. They're not designed to look at the needs of the whole country. And the parliamentarians are elected by us to set laws. But the problem is the courts have handcuffed them, because when they try to set laws on this, then those laws are struck down. So this is not just a problem in ethics or morals, it's a legal crisis. And very often you don't hear about that. No one is prepared to challenge the Supreme Court of Canada, but I think that there are restrictions. You ever heard them talk about the notwithstanding clause? Every time someone talks about Parliament getting their way, they say we would have to use the notwithstanding clause. And there's a big hue and cry. It would be unconstitutional. We live in a parliamentary democracy where your vote is supposed to count. So your politicians should be the ones to set these things, not the courts, in my opinion. So in the first legislation said that death had to be reasonably foreseeable in order for someone to get MAiD. But that was challenged by the Quebec Superior Court. Our current government decided not to appeal that, and as a result, new legislation was brought forward in 2021. And with this new legislation, it became legal for people with disabilities, people with chronic conditions, to get MAiD. And also, by 2027, it will be legal for people whose only presenting illness is a mental illness, it'll be legal for them to get MAiD. Most people don't understand that. As a matter of fact, some of you tonight are shocked when you hear this. Most people think that MAiD is for someone who's in their late 80s, who's at the end of their life. They might even be actively dying, and they're in pain, and they want to die by MAiD. But what I'm going to tell you tonight is that your idea of this is not correct. It's only the tip of the iceberg. MAiD is much more pervasive in our medical care system, and that's why we're concerned. Since MAiD was first legalized in Canada, we estimate that there have been 60,000 people who have died by MAiD. 60,000 people. This number is roughly equivalent to the population of Fredericton. So it'll give you an idea of how serious this is. So where are we going? By looking at other jurisdictions and also by looking at what's been happening in Canada, we can project that MAiD will be continuing to expand in Canada. A government commission has already proposed that MAiD be extended to what are called mature minors, people under the age of 18. And already Toronto Sick Kids Hospital has a protocol for this. And that protocol has no minimum age. And also children will be able to have their lives ended against the wishes of their parents. It will only be the child who will make the decision. There's also strong support for advanced directives. In the past couple of weeks, the Quebec government has indicated that very shortly they're going to be passing legislation to allow people to die by advanced directives. That means you'll be able to put in your will that when you get to a certain level of ability or disability, then it will be your intention to die even though you lack competence. So what this can mean, and see, no one knows how they're going to feel when they've got dementia, but in advance, we're going to be indicating that when we get to a certain level of dementia, then we will want to be euthanized. And it leads into real trouble because, as one psychiatrist told me, I've never had a dementia patient yet say they want to die. Often people with dementia are actually happier than they were during their lives. And so this is a problem. It puts the federal government in a real dilemma because if Quebec goes in this direction, then you can bet that there'll be pressure for the rest of the country to go this way as well. And currently we allow people to pre-qualify. So if you qualify with the illness that you currently have, then you can set a date after you lose competency to have your life ended. So one of our doctors is a psychiatrist. She got a note from a family physician indicating that on such and such a date in March of 2025, her patient will be being put to death. And because the patient is now incompetent, the patient can't change that, even though the psychiatrist has treated her depression and her husband said that she's much happier. So it's a very strange world and situation. So my conclusion is that we are getting very close to death on demand. And the proponents of euthanasia in Canada actually, I don't think will stop until suicide is normalized in Canada. In other words, people will be able to go to a doctor and say they want to commit suicide, and that will be permitted. Now, this slide is really important because it shows us the global rates of assisted dying. I want to show you first the orange line. This is the percentage of total deaths in the Netherlands over time, starting in 2002, with the beginning of their legalization of euthanasia in the Netherlands. And you can see that has increased quite dramatically. And this line here is kind of a gold line, is Belgium. You can see that has also increased, but even in 2022, it was just slightly over 2% of all deaths. This one here is Switzerland, and you can see that they're just about 1.5% of all deaths. And down here, this small line is California, which started about the same time as Canada, but you can see that they're not even up to 0.5% of all deaths. Now, why is that? That's because in the United States, they were smart enough to only legalize assisted suicide. So in the United States, any jurisdiction where it's legal, and it's the western states, Washington, Oregon, California, and a couple of others, you have to drink the poison yourself. And what we found is that people really don't want to drink the poison themselves. There's kind of a deterrent there. But in Canada, you can just have a sedative and you can be killed while you're asleep with the sedative. So I want to just show you now the graph in Canada. Starting in 2016, it has gone almost directly up to 2022. So this puts Canada in number 2 position after only 6 years of legalization. It puts Canada in number 2 position. And some people have suggested, and I think this is true, that by now, it's now almost 2 years later, that by now we're probably in number 1 position because we're increasing at a rate faster than any other country in the world. So we should all find this very, very disturbing. And as a matter of fact, even in 2022, 2 Canadian jurisdictions were higher than any other country in the world. And the 2 were Quebec, which is 6.9, 6.6, and BC, which is 5.5%. As a matter of fact, the rate of MAiD is so high on Vancouver Island, it has at some points been above 10% of all deaths. That would mean 1 in 10 are by MAiD. Now, I just want to show you some statistics, another way of looking at the statistics. Here's Canada. We took 3 years here, and we just compared, I think, between 2018 and 2021. The inside circle is 2018, the outside circle is 2021, and then we compared it in Canada, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, and in the United States, and you can see that the growth in Canada is staggering compared to these other countries. Now, you're probably saying, why is this happening in Canada? And I have 6 reasons I'd like to share with you. The first is that our criteria in Canada is the most vague in the world. In Canada, we use a term called grievous illness. But grievous illness, that term is neither a legal term nor a medical term. Who is to say what is grievous? Is arthritis grievous? Is blindness grievous? Is being a paraplegic grievous? It turns out that the interpretation of the word grievous is up to the individual doctor who does the assessment. So it's extremely subjective. The second concern is the word irremediable, because many jurisdictions require the person choosing MAiD to try all of the available treatments. In Canada, it's irremediable by any means acceptable to the patient. So if the patient doesn't want to try other treatments, they're not required. As a matter of fact, they don't have to try any treatments. As long as it's irremediable, then they can get euthanasia. So for instance, in Ontario, a 27-year-old young man who had a 65% chance of recovery from cancer chose MAiD because he didn't want to go through chemotherapy. Thirdly, it's up to the physician whether or not the criteria are met. So a physician decides whether or not the patient has met the criteria, and the physician's decision cannot be appealed, nor is there any oversight for what the physician decides. And finally, doctor shopping. So in Newfoundland and Labrador, a woman wanted to die by MAiD. No doctor in Newfoundland and Labrador would do it because they felt she did not qualify. She contacted Dying with Dignity. They flew one of their members out from Toronto. They assessed the person, and they ended up giving her euthanasia. So this will give you an idea of why the numbers are so high in Canada. So what's wrong with MAiD? Well, that's the reason for tonight's presentation. I just wanted to give you some background so you could understand what's going on. But we boiled it down to 3 things that are wrong with MAiD. First of all, it endangers people who are experiencing vulnerability. Secondly, if death is a therapeutic solution, what is the incentive to do anything else? We know that our healthcare system is in crisis. And in crisis, where there aren't enough beds in the hospital, if someone dies by MAiD, since it's now an acceptable therapeutic option, then that's really not a failure of the healthcare system in that mindset. So if you can solve the patient problem by them dying, then what is the incentive to do anything else? And finally, the most important thing for us as Christians, we are not the author of our own lives. Morality has an existential reality which we need to consider. Now, I'd like you to hear from my friend Tracy, who is a wonderful lady who has lived with a disability throughout her life. She's going to tell her story, and she's also going to talk about the implications of the legalization of euthanasia for persons with disabilities on her and on other members of that community.
Being able to wait to go to the bathroom the entire day was the price of my freedom, because I was in a regular high school in the community, and I was told if I couldn't do that, I would not be able to go out to high school because there was no assistance available with something like the washroom. And so, I just had to learn how to manage. When I came in, someone just had to turn the desk around the other way so I could sit at the desk because the chairs were attached, and I brought my own chair. So it was that was the only accommodation. Education was very important. It was important to our mom in particular, in our minds from a very early age, that this was a path that we need to be on, and to me it was a road to freedom. Living in the institution was always like the sword of Damocles, hanging over my head. Very, very afraid of that outcome. If I had to move into a nursing home at 18 years old and I was offered MAiD instead, I might very well have chosen that if I didn't see any hope for anything else happening. I went on to university, decided to learn to be a teacher. That was the beginning of the rest of my life. I was able to work at a private college that worked with adults who needed to read and write. We worked with people with disabilities, also people who were coming out of federal prisons, people who were getting off of the street, just people basically overlooked in society in many ways. That was very consistent with just my own growing belief about advocacy and, recognizing in people what other people might not recognize. And then from there, I was invited to work in the government and helping the government learn how to make their services more accessible to people with disabilities. One of the legacies was supporting the Ministry of Transportation in their efforts to have accessible en route stops. Just working with them to make them really accessible. So that was really great, and I'm able to enjoy that myself as now that I'm retired. And if I'm traveling somewhere, there's always a stop. It's really nice.
If the door was closed, you just kind of pushed it over.
I did my best. Or at least put a ramp in front of it.
Yeah. That's right.
if you stop to think about it, if a person cannot get help to get, up in the morning or get, enough meals a day, or, get out of the house sometimes when they want to be able to do that, like those things affect their quality of life more than their disability itself affects their quality of life. All Canadians do not currently have access to all of the supports that they need. When Canada was first thinking about a law for medical assistance in dying, I was quite concerned that this would be a slippery slope. It distresses me to be in a society that makes it easier for a person to choose death from a so-called menu of health options than to choose life because of having services in place. There was one woman who requested MAiD and got it after 2 years of fighting to get housing that would accommodate her needs as a person with environmental sensitivities, and is now dead when really she just needed to be moved to another, housing program that offered her the rental subsidy that she had without having to wait years for that. I think there is a prevailing attitude that people think they'd rather be dead than disabled. You're almost always at the brunt of those kinds of assumptions. And some people with disabilities will internalize that feeling. Their first reaction might be that they'd rather not live with that situation, losing their hearing and losing their mobility, losing their, capacity to make decisions, like whatever it may be. What people need are services, supports, to live in the community, things that actually truly meet their needs and continue to contribute to society as workers in the workforce, as parents, as brothers or sisters in a family, neighbors, as a friend. Like, people can contribute in many ways. If they had those supports, I don't think they would put MAiD on the top of their list.
I got a chance to get to know Tracy during the process of filming this video. And she is a woman who really inspired me and encourages me as well. Sometimes I can get down in the dumps, and it's great to phone her because she's overcome many more challenges than I've ever had to face. And she always has a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful attitude towards dealing with some of the challenges we had to face in getting this video out. One of the persons I want to quote is Dr. Madeline Lee. She is a psychiatrist at the University Health Network in downtown Toronto, and she manages the MAiD delivery program there. She is a MAiD provider herself. In 2023, she angered many of her colleagues by doing an article for Maclean's magazine. And in that article, she makes some startling statements. I just want to read one to you. Dr. Lee says, Canada's MAiD laws are missing fundamental safeguards for vulnerable people. That needs to change. I'm going to read that again. Canada's MAiD laws are missing fundamental safeguards for vulnerable people. That needs to change. She says the current law has no place for clinical judgment and no stipulation for meaningful conversation. And so what can happen, and happens frequently, is that when the assessments are done, they become like a checklist. In BC, I was giving a presentation, and a nurse said she had witnessed an assessment for MAiD that took 12 minutes. because the assessing doctor is just simply checking off boxes and doesn't spend the time having meaningful conversations with the patient to try to determine what the source of the suffering is and to see if there are alternatives. Yes, they're required by law to say, have you considered palliative care? But often that's just a question so they can check it off on the box. Now, why do people choose MAiD? As I mentioned, many of us have the idea that people are choosing MAiD because they're in intense physical pain. But this is not the reason people are choosing MAiD. These statistics here come from the Health Canada statistics on MAiD, and some of these numbers may surprise you. In 2022, of the people who chose MAiD, 53% did because they're experiencing a loss of dignity. 35% chose MAiD because they were a perceived burden to their family or friends. 17% chose MAiD because of loneliness and isolation. And 86% chose MAiD because of loss of ability to engage in meaningful life activities. And what do all these things have in common? They've got nothing to do with physical pain. And they're all things that could be resolved by proper counseling and proper care. Their pain is mentioned on here, but it's not just the pain experienced by the patient, it's fear of pain in the future. So if a patient is afraid of pain in the future, you deal with that by having them chat with a physician who can talk about the progression of their illness and what steps can be taken to deal with pain at every stage. The fact that they can access MAiD can make them feel like the healthcare system agrees that they are not valuable. And when that happens, their sense of their own dignity goes down, and when their sense of their own dignity is reduced, then they're more likely to choose MAiD. If the government was truly concerned about protecting vulnerable people, they would ensure that counseling existed for every person who is considering MAiD, and that there would be access to all services to prevent that MAiD happening. For instance, in Ontario, they have a care coordination service where patients can phone in to a 1-800 number and basically get matched to an assessor over the phone anywhere in Ontario. They have patient navigators, but those patient navigators can only make a referral for MAiD. They can't make a referral for other services. They can say, if you phone this number, you can get palliative care. But it's like we've created a super highway for MAiD, whereas the patients are on their own when they're looking for other services. And this is a real problem. MAiD is the one medical procedure, along with abortion perhaps, that is available all across Canada, no matter where you live. Whereas palliative care is not you're not able to access in all those places. Now, the second concern with MAiD, in terms of what's wrong with MAiD, is summed up in this statement: when MAiD is seen as a therapeutic option, then what is the incentive to do anything else? MAiD is not seen as a last resort. MAiD is seen as a therapeutic option. So, for instance, it's very common now for patients to be offered MAiD even though they don't ask it. The whole focus of today's medical care system in Canada is to normalize physician-assisted death. So it is like any other medical procedure, like getting a knee replacement or having your appendix removed. They want you to look at MAiD as if it is a therapeutic option. But the problem when you look at MAiD in that context is, what is the incentive to do anything else? What is the incentive to try anything else? If killing a patient is now healthcare, why do we put in the effort to try another thing? You see, and because of this, MAiD can act like a pressure valve on the system. Our healthcare system is in crisis, And by allowing MAiD, it removes patients from the system and frees up hospital beds. If we really cared about vulnerable people, we would ensure that the services exist to care for them and not force them to choose MAiD. Only 30 to 50% of Canadians have access to proper palliative care, according to the Hospice and Palliative Care Association of Canada. And in fact, there are 2 documented cases of health authorities in Ontario who told their palliative care sections to create a MAiD service within their existing budget. And what that does is, by reducing the amount of palliative care, it then drives people to MAiD. I was on the plane one time with this lady. We were talking about her husband who had passed away a couple of months before. And she asked me what I did, and I explained it. She said, my husband could have used MAiD. I said, why is that? She said, well, when he had his cancer removed in the hospital, his pain was controlled. But he wanted to get out of the hospital and come home with me. And when he did, his pain was not controlled. And then in the last 2 weeks of his life, they put him into a hospice where his pain was well controlled. So she said, we could have used MAiD. Well, she can't see the big picture. What she should have said was, we could have used palliative home care, the extramural hospital that you have in New Brunswick, which exists in Toronto, but not in Timmins where she lived. Do you see what's going on? Poor patients, they have no idea why services are available or they're not. They don't even have any idea that services could be available if the funding existed. Instead, when they run up against a brick wall, they go, I may as well die. And that's what's happening. And for years, we've been hearing in the media that we have a mental health crisis in Canada. You know, Bell, let's talk. The problem with MAiD is that when it becomes legal in 2027 for people whose only presenting illness is mental health, there'll be a 3-month waiting period to die, and the average wait time for a psychiatrist in Canada is 6 months. And probably in our maritime provinces, even longer than that. So what are people with a psychiatric illness expected to do when they're in a situation that they're unable to cope, and when MAiD is accessible in 3 months, and a psychiatrist visit is accessible in 6 months? Dr. Lee again has talked about this. Gaps in the law become a bigger problem with mental disorders. Gaps in the law become a bigger problem with mental disorders. I had the privilege a couple of weeks ago of talking to all the people in New Brunswick who lead the MAiD program here. We went and spoke to the Premier, Premier Higgs, who is very concerned about this. And we went to talk to him about the idea of having a service in New Brunswick so that when people call in asking for MAiD, the first person they talk to would be an objective person who would have the capacity to refer them to all services and not just to MAiD. So in talking to some of the doctors who do MAiD, I wanted to be careful not to offend them. Even though I disagree with what they're doing, I didn't want to be offensive because I knew if we got their backs up, they wouldn't work with us. And so I quoted Dr. Lee. I thought, I'll let Dr. Lee do the dirty work, and I'll just quote her. And I won't offend anybody. And they said to me, don't worry, you're not offending us. We know there are gaps. Let that sink in for a minute. Who's falling through the gaps? Patients. Are they strong patients who have privilege, like our Prime Minister, or like the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or some wealthy business person? Are they slipping through the cracks? No. Who's slipping through the cracks? The vulnerable. And I got it right directly from them. That's what they said. We know that there are gaps. There have been some blatant, horrific gaps. Normand, Meunier from Montreal, a quadriplegic. In January 2024, he had a respiratory infection. His wife was an excellent advocate. There was no room in the hospital for Normand. All he had was a respiratory infection. His wife told them in the ER that if he didn't have a special mattress, he would get bed sores. But hospital policy was they could not put these mattresses in the emergency room. They had access to 145 of them within the hospital system, but they weren't allowed to put them in the emergency room because the only cots you could have in the emergency room were the emergency stretchers that they have. So they kept him on a stretcher for 5 days. At the end of this, his bed sores were so deep, both his muscle and bone were exposed. After being released from the hospital, Normand was in horrible pain. And in March 2024, he applied for and received MAiD. Because the staff at the ER were too overburdened to give Normand the care he needed, his situation worsened to the point that he lost the will to live. He died because of a lack of the proper mattress. When they interviewed him before his death, Normand said he didn't want to be a burden. The healthcare system, whose job it is to ease others' burdens, instead placed so heavy a burden on Normand that he lost hope. The next one is Sophia. Sophia was referred to in Tracy's video. She had chemical sensitivities, environmental illness. She could not afford proper housing. She needed a place that was free of cigarette smoke and harsh chemical cleaners. She couldn't afford it. Her friends tried a GoFundMe campaign. They couldn't raise enough money. And finally, she went and asked for MAiD, and she was approved. Now, she's not dying from this, right? She only needs housing free of cigarette smoke and harsh chemical cleaners. Didn't have the money, and she goes and applies for MAiD and gets it. But before she died, she left a video. And her family got that video to Avis Favreau, who's the healthcare correspondent with CTV, and it became national news. On the video, she says, "I don't want to die, but I can't afford proper housing." Now, my question is, who is the doctor who assessed her and signed off on her dying? This is a person who checked the boxes. Does Sophia have a grievous illness? Yes. Is it irremediable by any means that the patient has at their disposal? Yes. Do you understand the problem? Dr. Lee says if someone is suffering primarily because they can't afford housing, do we think that death is an appropriate solution for that? The third case I want to talk about is one that is really disturbing me. Well, they're all disturbing, but this one's disturbing, I guess, because I spoke to the person directly. 2 weeks ago, Brad and I spent an hour and a half. She had a person who had disabilities from the time she was a teenager up until now. She's probably in her 50s. 2 years ago, they found a lump in her breast. She had to have a mastectomy. She determined that she should have a second mastectomy as a preventative in case the cancer came back. In her interactions to have those 2 mastectomies, she was offered MAiD 3 times. 3 times. Once was when she was on the gurney being wheeled to the operating room. I wish I could say that's a one-off. It's not. It's common. Our doctors that work with me in Nova Scotia say that it happens right from one end of the province to the other. And I've already heard from people in New Brunswick who've come to me and said that MAiD was offered to them. Once we normalize MAiD, then it becomes like any other medical procedure, and then it gets offered to patients. What was the impact on this poor lady? She no longer felt safe in the hospital because someone was saying to her, "You have a disability. Therefore, I'm going to offer MAiD to you." That was 2 years ago. Her cancer is in remission, and she's very happy she didn't choose that. But that time, She was in the hospital. She was so upset. As soon as she was well enough, she got out and sat on a park bench at the door to the hospital. And there she put her head in her hands and sobbed because she didn't feel safe in the hospital. So those are two reasons about what's wrong with MAiD. The third one, and perhaps what's most important for those of us who are Christians, is that we are not the authors of our own lives. As Christians, we take our direction on the value of life from the Word of God and the Christian tradition. And God said in Exodus 20:13, "You shall not murder." And then Jesus adopted that teaching in Matthew 19:18. It's actually going to be the gospel for this weekend for Catholics. And I'm preaching in Truro on this topic. The rich young man comes to Jesus. What must I do to inherit eternal life? What's Jesus say? Go to the casino? He says, keep the commandments. He said, keep the commandments. And included there, you shall not murder. What part of that don't we understand? Then Jesus goes further. He ups the ante, using casino language. He says in Matthew 25, whatever you do for the least of these, you do it to me. Whatever you do for the least of these, you do it to me. Who's the least of these? It's vulnerable people. It's the people who are sick. We're called to visit them, not kill them. It's people like Tracy. We're called to support her and rally around her, not end her life, not offer her MAiD. That's what we're called to as Christians. We're called to speak out when we see vulnerable people being offered death rather than offered life. Whatever you did for the least of these, you did it for me. If we're ignoring the least of these, we are ignoring Jesus. And if you read the gospel, it doesn't go well for those that ignored him. Does it? It does not go well. We're called as Christians to live like Christ, to incorporate his values into our heart and in our life. And we are called by Christ to see his presence in the vulnerable person. Brothers and sisters, as Christians, we're not just viewing Christianity. We're not just like in a cinema watching a movie. We're called to act. We're called to respond to the love that Christ has given us. We're all offered grace. We're called to respond to that grace. We're called to be more like Christ. That's the whole role of being a Christian, the process of sanctification, to be more like Christ. And look what he says. I'm a lawyer. I can't find the loophole in that statement. Anybody see a loophole? So why do we think that we can promote death? Why do we think that we can choose euthanasia? Why do we think that it's appropriate that this should be the law of our country? Do you know, this is an embarrassing statistic, but in 2014, Angus Reid did a survey amongst Catholics who went to church at least once in the previous month. Do you know that 70% were in favor of assisted suicide? What's with that? How do we connect that with this? Now, Pastor, I'm happy to say that the relevant figure for evangelicals is 40%. So somehow, you guys are doing a better job of communicating this to your people than we are to ours. But you probably aren't rejoicing on 40% either. No. So we have some work to do, don't we, brothers and sisters? We have some work to do. When I was in Ottawa, I said to Cardinal Collins, and he and I were up there lobbying against MAiD. I said, and we would be lobbying with people who are regular church attenders, who are going, I can't go against the Supreme Court of Canada. So who's more important, God or the Supreme Court of Canada? We have to get our priorities right. And then we have to ask ourselves, how does the legalization of MAiD reflect upon the overall health of our society? And I think this is an important factor for all of us. When we look at the reasons that people are choosing MAiD, a lack of a sense of dignity, a lack of purpose, a lack of meaning, these are all symptoms of a culture that has decided to turn its back on God. Okay? We have the message of the gospel. We have a message and a person who gives us hope. We have a person, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, that came into the world that gives us hope and meaning. We can't keep that to ourselves because our society is dying because they don't know it. Do you understand? MAiD is a symptom of a sick society. And we know the great physician. We have to get the word out. We have to get evangelization out. Our medical care system is being hijacked and its values are being upended. A good health outcome is never causing death. So I want to talk about Nova Scotia. I know we're in New Brunswick, but this is a cautionary tale. In Nova Scotia, we have physicians in all provinces are regulated by a regulatory body called the College. So you would have the College of Physicians and Surgeons of New Brunswick. In Nova Scotia, we have the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Nova Scotia. Our college in Nova Scotia has a strong influence by some people who are real ideologues when it comes to euthanasia. And they believe that it should be established as a regular part of medical care and should be treated exactly like that. So just as we treat getting a knee replacement, so also we should treat euthanasia. So they're saying doctors must make a referral for euthanasia for their patients. That means they must sit down and write a letter and say to another doctor, would you please see my patient because I think it's a good thing for them to get euthanasia. Christian doctors can't do that. The second thing they want is they want us to offer MAiD to patients when we think they might qualify. So we have an internal medicine specialist who installs pacemakers. When she has a patient who has a heart arrhythmia, she will now be required to say, you can get a pacemaker, or I'm required to tell you that you can get MAiD. This policy has happened in Nova Scotia. We have 42 doctors who have come forward to say they cannot work under that policy. We tried to communicate with the college. They won't return our emails. We tried to talk to the Minister of Health. She refuses to meet with us. The Archbishop of Halifax wrote to the Minister of Health. She won't talk to him because there is this dramatic secularization of our healthcare system, and Christians are more and more and more seen as people that are irrelevant to this system. No, there is a concern that this same policy is coming to New Brunswick. And Brad is going to pass around a clipboard. We have the emails of all those who registered. But if you didn't register tonight, would you mind putting down your name and your email so that we can contact you if and when we need to have a campaign here in New Brunswick? They're going to be rewriting their policy next year. This week, on Monday, Brad and I met with 4 students at Dalhousie University campus in St. John. And these students are worried that if a similar policy comes to New Brunswick, they will not be able to practice. Now, this is, in my view, ridiculous. These are 4 wonderful young doctors who want to practice in New Brunswick, but may be unable to because of this college policy if it comes to New Brunswick. So we ask you to consider giving us your name and your number. We need to stand in solidarity to help protect physician conscience rights. And if these physicians are unable to practice, who will be there to find alternative options for MAiD? So what can we do? Pray. That's the most important thing. I hope by now you can see that there's some evil stuff going on here, right under our noses. Most Christians are unaware of what's happening and how quickly it's happening. So we need to, first of all, pray and ask the Lord to help us be victorious against these dark forces. The only way there's going to be change is if we all participate in helping make that change happen. I did a presentation in Dartmouth, and after the presentation, many people immediately called their MLA. And when we went to visit that MLA, he said, I've been getting a lot of calls about this issue. That's the way you bring about change. Because the people on the other side of the issue, they know the number of their MLA. They'll call them real quick. If we're not also calling them, then the MLAs won't know that there are people on the other side of this. The second thing is share. Share information about this project with your friends on social media. And write. So as soon as we know that if there's a problem in New Brunswick, we'll be contacting you and asking you to write letters to your MLA. We have a program called No Options, No Choice, where you can go on that website and immediately, like within 2 minutes, write an email to your MLA expressing concerns that there are not proper alternatives to MAiD in New Brunswick. And right now, like I said, we've been working with the current premier to try to develop other access points for services for people who are choosing MAiD in New Brunswick. Also, there are many things that our organization can do for you. We will get you prayer cards if you want to get people praying on this. We have preaching notes for pastors of all denominations, letter writing, and finally I want to talk about Dying with Christ, Living with Hope. The course is 3 evenings, 3 25-minute videos, a booklet that we provide to every participant. We ask for a $10 donation per booklet, if you can afford it, to help us with the costs of the program. And it's designed to help people understand what a Christian death looks like. And we feel that this program really helps people understand death, dying, and the Christian perspective. It also explains what's wrong with MAiD. And we now have trained 100 facilitators all across Canada. This program is operating all over. So we want to thank you, myself and Brad, for your attendance here tonight, for your concerns about this issue, and for you coming forward.